Mr. Robert Spencer, welcome here on Daring Question.
Thank you.
And first of all, I just want you to introduce yourself to our viewers in the Arab world.
I am Robert Spencer, the director of Jihad Watch, which you can find on the internet at jihadwatch.org. And that is a news and commentary site that is updated many times daily with information about jihad activity all around the world and the belief system that inspires that jihad activity. And this, of course, is information that in many parts of the Western world in particular, it is not known why these things are happening, and there's a great deal of deceit and obfuscation about it. And so I attempt to clear that up. And I've also written 9 books about Islam, jihad, and terrorism.
Okay. Can you introduce some of your books to the viewers so they can get familiar with the content?
Certainly. I wrote a biography of the Prophet of Islam, The Truth About Muhammad, which was based on the earliest biographies of Muhammad that were written by Muslims, primarily that of Ibn Ishaq through the recension of Ibn Hisham and Ibn Sa'd. And they paint a picture of Muhammad that many people are not aware of, that they assume certain things about him. People generally tend to assume, particularly in the Western world, of course, because of the influence of Christianity, that anybody who is the founder of a great world religion is someone who taught universal peace, benevolence, charity, brotherhood, the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man, and so on. And actually, of course, when it comes to Muhammad, he was a very different individual who taught that, well, in the words of the Quran itself, he says, Muhammad is the apostle of Allah, and those who follow him are merciful to one another, but ruthless to the unbelievers. And that, of course, is a creed that he followed out all through his life, as I show in the book. Religion of Peace is a book that I wrote to counter the common view that Christianity and Islam are essentially equivalent in their capacity to inspire violence, and that the Bible is just as violent as the Quran. There are many passages in the Bible that depict people committing acts of violence and even doing so at the order of God. But there's a fundamental difference, as I explain in the book in some detail, and that, of course, is only one of the things in the book.
Yeah, I'll get into that in another question, but just in general.
That in general, that there's really no equivalent to the exhortations to violence in the Quran and all through Islamic teaching and history. The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades is a general introduction to the teachings of Islam, especially those that give rise to violence and make Islamic believers think that it is part of their responsibility before God to commit acts of violence.
And can I ask, how did all this start? How did you start thinking? Did you come from, what is your background? And how did you start getting interested in Islam, writing about Islam?
Well, when I was very young, my grandparents lived with us, and they were elderly, kindly people. And as I got to know them, as I got older, they told me at one point that they were exiles from the Ottoman Empire, or what is now Turkey. And that ultimately I discovered that they had been exiled for declining an invitation to convert to Islam.
They were Christians?
Yes. And so this, I thought, was very curious because I couldn't understand. I mean, usually when one reads, particularly in classical literature, about exile, it's as the result of a crime. And so I didn't understand how it could be that one's choice in conscience, one's decision in conscience to follow one religion or another could be the subject of exile. And so I was fascinated by that, and also by the whole culture and environment that would give rise to that kind of thinking. And so I started to, when I was in college, to read the Quran, read the Quran for the first time at that time. And
you started with the Quran?
Yes. Yes. Well, actually, it's because I met some Muslim students in college, and this was something that was of great interest to me because of my family, and so I started to ask them about Islam, which of course was something they were very happy to discuss with me. And they said, if you want to know about Islam, read the Quran. And so I took that very seriously and read the Quran from the beginning to the end.
In English?
In English, for the first time. But it was the a translation made by a Muslim, actually an English convert to Islam. And that was recommended to me by them.
And what did you find?
I found that the Quran makes a very sharp distinction between believers and unbelievers, and that it exhorts kindness and charity toward believers, but is openly hateful and exhorting to violence to unbelievers. And I found that to be quite a shock, really, at the first encounter with it. But it began to make sense of what had happened to my own family.
Okay.
And I began to see why Muslim believers who took the Quran seriously might not take kindly to the presence of Christians who had declined to convert to Islam.
Right.
And later, when I began to read deeply into the Hadith, and I found Muhammad saying, first invite the unbelievers to Islam, or invite them to pay the jizya,
Yeah, right.
and then if they refuse, go to war with them, I thought, well, this is exactly what happened in my family's experience.
And did you go to commentaries or other
Yes.
books to help you understand? Because the Quran, I know in English, probably is just, it's easier, probably more than Arabic.
Yes.
But did you need other books to explain?
Oh, very much so. And because solely out of a personal interest at that time, I began to read, well, see, this is something I went to them. Here again, I have to thank my Muslim friends in college, although they would probably not be very happy to receive the gratitude.
Were they trying to convert you?
Oh, very much so, yes.
Okay.
Although when it became clear that I was not going to convert, then suddenly we weren't friends anymore.
Okay.
And in any case, I went to them and I said that I was reading the Quran, and they were very pleased about that. And I said, how is it that you can help me to understand it more fully?
Yeah.
And so they introduced me to various tafsir, to the Hadith.
Okay.
And I think they were perhaps surprised that I actually began to read them.
Okay.
And I started out with Abdullah Yusuf Ali's Quran,
Right.
which has the notes.
Yes.
But of course, as I began to discover, they are very much written for a Western audience and
Right.
written in order to soften some of
It's
the more...
watered down.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And so, but the references in them and some of the other recommendations that I'd received from these people led me to writers like Ibn Kathir,
All right.
to the Tafsir al-Jalalain,
Okay.
Qurtubi, and to various hadith collections, Bukhari and Muslim, and
Did they confirm what you found earlier in the Quran?
not only confirmed, but reinforced, it made even stronger, especially when you see the words and deeds of Muhammad himself and see how he himself pursued warfare against Jews in particular, but also against Christians toward the end of his life. And of course, the pagan Quraysh, and how he lived out the exhortations in the Quran. And then in the Sirah, you start to see, in the biographies of Muhammad, you start to see that some of the conflicting passages in the Quran where they say, go to the unbelievers with beautiful preaching,
Right.
or you have your religion and we have ours, and that's
Right,
it.
right.
And how that fits together with the make war upon them and slay them wherever you find them.
Right.
And you see that there is the idea of the development of the theology and the doctrine of abrogation.
Between
which,
Mecca and Medina.
exactly,
Right.
which exalts the violent passages and makes them the ones that are applicable for all time.
Right, right. So I understood fully Islam. How long have you been studying Islam so far?
Well, this all started when I was in college about 1980, 81, so it's almost 30 years now.
Well, now we heard like several attempt to do terrorist acts, or some of them succeeded, some of them not. And Americans, all the West, still doesn't understand Islam as they should. And like, what do you think the real problem with the West understanding Islam?
Well, I think the main reason why the West does not understand Islam is because nobody's telling them about it, and that people are actively lying to them about it from the highest levels. For example, the President of the United States, in response to the Christmas Day attempt to destroy an airplane by an Islamic jihadist
Right.
flying into Detroit, he spoke about stepping up the war against Al-Qaeda but didn't mention Islam or Muslims once. And it's very clear that he actually even said that the vast majority of Muslims abhor al-Qaeda and support us in this effort, which of course is pure fantasy. It's like if President Roosevelt during World War II had gone on the radio and said, we are at war with the Luftwaffe, but we know the vast majority of Germans support us in this effort.
Yeah,
it's
it doesn't
sheer
make any
fantasy.
sense, right?
And so the problem is that the president is not telling the truth. His predecessor did not tell the truth. His predecessor, right after 9/11, George W. Bush went into the mosque in Washington and with the Islamic leaders around him and said Islam is a religion of peace.
Right.
We have the mainstream media, the major television networks, the newspapers. They have a policy that you cannot speak about.
Why?
Well, it seems there's several reasons, I think. One is that they are afraid that if they speak honestly about the elements of Islam that give rise to supremacism and violence, that there will be violence against innocent Muslims in the United States.
Okay.
Now that, I think, is a completely spurious fear. And it's completely spurious because there have been so many attacks and attempted attacks. There have been over 30 attempted jihad attacks in the United States since 9/11.
Okay.
Now, most of them were stopped beforehand, but still there's some publicity even when the attempt is foiled.
One of them succeeded in the Fort Hood, sure.
And they succeeded at Fort Hood. He almost succeeded in Detroit.
Right.
There was, of course, 9/11 itself. There have been many, many this year. As a matter of fact, 10 of the 30 were in 2009. It seems like a sharp uptick in the frequency of these things, and still Muslims are coming to the United States. They're living in the United States. They're not bothered, and that's a good thing. That's a testimony to the decency of the American people, and shows that fear is groundless. I think that there's a larger reason why we're being lied to, and that is that there is a globalist agenda among the elites, the governing elites in America and Europe.
Okay.
And that through the initiatives like the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership in Europe, which is a series of agreements between the European Union and the Islamic states of the Mediterranean, and also the U.S. Muslim Engagement Project, which sketches out a very similar program for the United States and has been endorsed at the highest levels.
Okay.
They are hoping to come to a series of international accords but that include the Islamic world and the Western world, and that establish various trade agreements and cultural agreements.
Okay.
And they hope thereby to, I think, diffuse what they see as the negative power of nationalism and prevent future wars. But because they are dealing with the Islamic world in this way, and you know that, of course, Islam in its essence is intransigent and uncompromising.
Right.
They don't realize this, but they are coming up against it in these negotiations. They are having to make various concessions to Islamic demands.
Right.
And this will lead to the advance of Islam in the West, but also it had induced them to adopt some of the classic strictures of Sharia, of Islamic law, in dealing with the Islamic world. And so they don't speak ill of Allah or Muhammad.
Right.
They don't speak ill of Islam. And that means, because the Organization of the Islamic Conference has made sure that it means, that they do not speak about the Islamic roots of modern terrorist activity.
Why do they do, like, they can criticize Christianity, and I have seen several shows that attack Christianity on the media, and they don't do the same thing about Islam. Why this double standards?
Well, I think that the simplest answer to that is that Christianity is not the same kind of global political force today that Islam is.
Okay.
And that they therefore do not believe that they need to make the same kind of accommodation with Christianity in order to create this new world order that they're trying to create.
Okay, I see. Another thing, some Americans are defending their views, saying these terrorist attacks or temptations of terrorist attacks are just isolated incidents, and it's not fair to condemn the whole Muslim world or Islam in general. So how you respond to that?
Well, I don't think we should condemn Anyone, really. Ultimately, we should respond to everyone in charity, but with our eyes open, and understand that if someone is coming at me and wanting to kill me, that there's no sin in defending myself and defending my family and my nation ultimately. The president himself said that the Flight 253 bomber in Detroit was an isolated extremist, but in reality he does have numerous ties to Islamic jihadists. And the problem here is that not to condemn individuals, or particularly Muslims who are not involved in this, but to understand that those who are involved in it are working from Islamic theological principles. They are working from the teachings of the Quran. They are working from the teachings of Muhammad. They are working from the Hadith, from Islamic law and Islamic jurisprudence. All the schools of Islamic law teach that it is part of the responsibility of the Islamic community, of the Ummah, to wage war against unbelievers.
But these groups are exceptions and probably just misunderstood some passages in the Quran.
Well, now this is fantasy. This is what people assume, but they assume it without knowledge.
Okay.
Because actually, see, I would say, if I'm not a Muslim and I've read the Quran, then I'm not going to presume to understand it. I'm not going to presume to interpret it of myself.
Right.
And so what I did in my own experience was I went to see how Muslims themselves understood it.
Right.
And so I discovered in the first place that it's mainstream, traditional Islamic theology that is held essentially universally by Muslims, that the violent passages supersede the peaceful ones.
Right.
And there is no school of Islamic jurisprudence anywhere in the world that does not teach the necessity for Muslims to wage war against unbelievers.
Okay.
And so it's not either an isolated group of people who have twisted the religion, it's the mainstream teaching of the religion. I would like to be able to, you would think from the popular view that the leading authorities and leading schools, the madhhab, the schools of jurisprudence, that
the four schools,
that you would think from the popular view that they all teach peace, that they all teach love for Christians and everyone else, and that it's some marginal heretical group that has decided that it's all about warfare.
Right.
But actually, they all teach warfare. They all teach that it is the responsibility of the Ummah to make war against Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians until they become Muslim or pay the jizya, which is based on the Quran, chapter 9, verse 29.
Right.
Fight against the Jews and Christians, fight against the people of the book until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued.
Right.
So you have this as a responsibility of the Muslims. Not every Muslim is going to put that into practice, but actually those that are not putting it into practice are the ones who are at variance with the mainstream teaching.
Okay. So how you respond if somebody say, look, Muslims are peaceful. I have my neighbor who is a nice guy. He's like any other American or European. And why we should talk negative about Islam? Muslims are not the same. Some of them are like Balad and some of them are peaceful and nice.
Well, human nature is everywhere the same. And so there's nothing essentially different about Muslims that would make them more violent than anyone else, except the teachings of Islam.
Okay.
But in every human being, there are a variety of experiences. There are a variety of perspectives, a variety of values. There's a variety of influences upon every individual soul.
Okay.
So in every individual soul, there's a spectrum of belief. In every religious tradition, I should say, there's a spectrum of belief and of knowledge and of fervor. Some people who are Christians are very devout and very knowledgeable, and some people who are Christians are completely indifferent to the teachings of Christ, and they make no attempt to put them into practice, but they still would call themselves Christians if asked.
Right.
And so, there's every other stage in between. A huge number of people and a huge variety of ways of manifesting Christianity, or at least of living out their lives as they say that they are Christians.
Okay.
Now, it's the same way with Islam. There's some people who know Quran, who love Quran, and they live in every way by Quran. And those are the ones to be careful about.
Okay.
Because they will be wanting to make war against Jews and Christians.
So the deeper you go into Islam, the extreme
Yes, exactly.
you will be.
But it's a little bit more difficult, a little bit more complicated in Islam for a variety of reasons. For example, most Muslims are not Arabs. Most Muslims are not native Arab speakers today. The largest Islamic country is Indonesia. And so you have to pray in Arabic. You have to recite Quran in Arabic.
Right.
People can be very devout and observant in Pakistan or Afghanistan
Right.
or Indonesia and not know very clearly what the contents of the teaching are at all. Unless
Even the
they've been
Arabs, they don't
exhorted.
know because
Exactly.
it's written in an old
Classical Arabic is not modern
Right.
Arabic.
Right.
So it's very easy to perform all the ceremony, all the ceremonial, the ritual requirements of the 5 prayers a day and so on, and to recite Quran. I remember actually this is something that when I am speaking and I speak to American audiences, they always think it's a joke, and it's not a joke.
Right.
A Pakistani Muslim and I were discussing this a few years ago. And he said to me very seriously, he said, I am very proud of my religion, and I have memorized almost all of the Quran. And one day I plan to get one of those translations and find out what it means.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah, and so if the local imam, if the local teachers are not exhorting people like that to warfare, then they might not have any idea that these things are elements of Islam at all.
Right.
And yet be very religious, very observant, very devout.
Right. Some Muslims compare the violence in the Quran to the violence in the Old Testament. They say, look, it's all the same. So if you're going to condemn the violence in the Quran, why you don't condemn the Old Testament with the same measure?
There are several aspects to that. One is that there are no Jewish or Christian exegetes. There are no Jewish or Christian scholars ever who have ever read the book of Joshua and said, you see, the prophet, he cleared out these cities, and so therefore we must do the same thing and fight against our enemies in the same way. In other words, no one has ever, no Jew or Christian has ever taken those passages as meaning that these are instructions for the way he should behave as a believer today.
Right.
The passages in the Old Testament that are violent are descriptive rather than prescriptive. In other words, they describe various things that were done by various prophets, and it's been problematic for Jewish and Christian scholars all through history as to how God could order that kind of thing. Generally, they have understood the passages in a spiritual way as parables in a certain sense for fighting against sin in one's soul. But never have they understood them as instructions, whereas in the Quran, the believers are ordered by God to make war against the unbelievers. Okay. And this is a prescription, in other words, not just a description of somebody doing something that is not necessarily to be imitated.
Right.
And so that's one of the most important differences. Also, of course, for Christians, the New Testament comes after the Old. And so I've had so many Muslims say, how can you condemn the practice of stoning when stoning is prescribed in the Old Testament?
Torah,
and I say, well, I can condemn it because in the 8th chapter of the Gospel of John, the Lord Jesus condemns it. And essentially, and says that makes it impossible by setting a standard that no one can live up to in order to carry it out.
Okay.
And so we, as Christians, read the Old Testament in light of the New, and that changes our understanding of it to a tremendous degree. But it also must be said that even in the rabbinic tradition in Judaism, these passages have been spiritualized, and there is no tradition in anywhere that takes them as literal instructions. And so in the Islamic tradition, unfortunately, there is no such tradition anywhere of the spiritualizing of Quranic passages that exhort to violence, or any blunting of their force, their literal force, to incite the believers to commit violence.
So you see it different. It's not the same kind of violence.
Exactly.
And some Muslims are trying to defend Islam, saying that, look at these attacks are carried against UK, United States, countries who have wars against Muslim countries. So they brought it upon themselves rather than it's coming from Islam. It's just a reaction to what the United States is doing in the Middle East and other countries and what UK is doing in the Middle East. And how you respond to that?
Well, the problem is, before the US was doing anything in the Middle East, before the UK was doing anything in the Middle East, there was jihad.
Okay.
And there was jihad against the West. There was jihad against Christian Europe. The Ottomans were in Vienna in 1683. and that was the high point of their advance into Europe.
Right.
But they weren't reacting to U.S. policy. There was no U.S.
Right.
The reality is that all the jihads today are defensive. It's true. And that's a function of Islamic theology.
Right.
Because in Islamic law, only the caliph can declare offensive jihad.
Right.
And there is no caliph, not since 1924 when the
Right.
Turkish government abolished the office.
Right.
And so there is no one authorized in the Islamic world to declare offensive jihad against non-Muslims.
Okay.
And so the jihadis have an obligation, if they want to portray their jihad as correct Islamically, they have to portray it as defensive. Because defensive jihad, you need no approval for, you need no permission for.
Right.
It becomes the obligation of every individual Muslim as soon as an Islamic land is attacked.
Right.
So the grievance theater that we see in the Islamic world, the complaining about various atrocities of the West, the endless complaint, whining about what Israel has done or what the United States has done or what the UK has done, it really has a purpose, and that is to justify the jihads from a theological standpoint within Islam.
Okay.
But it is incorrect to say that if the West were to stop doing these things, then the jihad would cease.
So you see it as excuses used by terrorists to like kind of propaganda of their
Yes.
jihad strategy
Oh, yes.
among Muslims?
Yes, quite so. And the pretexts always shift, but the jihad remains.
Okay.
If Israel were to cease to exist tomorrow, they would wage jihad against Spain and find provocation to do
Right.
so. If the United States were to withdraw all its troops from the whole world tomorrow,
Right.
they would find some other offense somehow
Okay.
and continue to wage jihad, because jihad is a responsibility for Muslims. And so it's not something that is going to end. And ultimately, there are many attempts to restore the caliphate.
Right.
Even Mullah Omar was named the caliph in Afghanistan in
Right.
1996.
Right.
And not many people recognize him as such. But if someone were to grow more powerful than he is, then it's possible he could attract that kind of following and then declare an offensive jihad.
Right. And here, if we're talking about Muslims in the West, do you have any statistics about, at least in the U.S., how many Muslims you have?
There's a great deal of controversy about that. The Islamic advocacy groups in the United States, which are linked to the Muslim Brotherhood, they tend to exaggerate the numbers to a tremendous degree.
Okay.
And so they try to exaggerate the political power of Islam in the United States by saying there's 7 million Muslims in the United States, 9 million Muslims, and so on. The reality is much different. The Pew Research Center, which is a survey, a group that has conducted a number of very illuminating and important surveys among Muslims in the United States and around the world, they estimate 2.3 million Muslims in the United States.
Okay.
But it's very interesting to note that nobody ever asks or cares how many Buddhists there are in the United States. It's only a function of the political aspects and supremacist aspects and violent aspects of Islam that make this a question that's of any note.
Right. And do we have any statistics about converts every year, like people who convert to Islam from Americans?
No, that's also unclear, because here again it's wildly exaggerated.
Okay.
There are stories of converts to Islam. It's something that is very much trumpeted in the press in the Islamic world. Generally, a convert to Islam of reasonable prominence will get a big write-up in Al Jazeera in English.
Right.
And a great deal of publicity.
Right.
And so actually, if you track those stories, which I do, there aren't very many of them. So I'm not sure that there are...
I heard 20,000 a year. Some
well, that's
people
that's
say.
an impressive number. But a lot of those are people who have know nothing about Islam and are not becoming Muslim because they are convinced in conscience that it's true, but because they're getting married.
Okay.
Or something like that, and they are told by their by the spouse. I mean, generally, it's a woman, because it's
Why women?
because Islam forbids a non-Muslim man to marry a Muslim woman.
Right.
The idea is that Islam is always increasing and the non-Muslims are always decreasing. And so a Muslim man can marry a non-Muslim woman, but a Muslim woman cannot marry a non-Muslim man. And so the man has to convert to Islam if in that event. And I know many men who have done so, and then they have told me later they had no idea what they were getting into and are
They
very sorry.
reconverted?
Some of them have. I actually know some of them who it's a sad thing to say, but American-born American people who have lived all their lives in the United States, but they met here a Malaysian or an Indonesian or a Pakistani woman, and they convert to Islam and get married.
Right.
And then they find out about Islam and become disenchanted, but they also find out they can't leave. And so I know several men who are
Get stuck.
outwardly Muslim. They don't feel free enough or safe enough to declare that they're no longer Muslim,
Right.
because they're in touch with even the immigrant communities in the United States would threaten their lives.
Do you think money is used in spreading Islam in the United States, especially from countries like Saudi Arabia and others?
Yes, very much so. Absolutely. In many ways. The Saudis, in the first place, are spending millions of dollars to spread Islam. And so they have been underwriting proselytizing efforts, building mosques, underwriting efforts to convert people to Islam in prisons.
Right.
And that's one way they're spending money. But also, when you convert to Islam in that kind of context, it may be that you will find a very willing support network that will suddenly be taking care of maybe some financial difficulties that you have and some other kinds of difficulties.
Right.
And these things are great incentives, of course, for people.
You mentioned prisons, and I read statistics about American inmates in American prisons. They say 20% of them are Muslims. And so why prisons?
I think that one of the main reasons why there's so much targeting of American prisoners and attempts to convert them to Islam is because there you have a base of people that is already alienated from the society. And that is already, in many cases, violent.
Right.
And you can come to them and channel their alienation and violence and say, this is something that God blesses, that God wants.
Right.
God wants you to hate these people, and they are hateful. And God wants you to make war against them.
So they give them a legitimate excuse.
It legitimizes the things that landed them into prison in the first place.
Right. There are some organizations in the United States like CARE and others are trying to follow the media and trying to see all kind of cases and file lawsuits against anybody who tried to say anything about Islam or try to do anything to any Muslim, even some funny cases at the airport. You remember some Muslims were praying and doing some suspicious acts and they were arrested. So CARE filed a lawsuit against the government in that case. So these organizations, what do you think their agenda in the United States?
Oh, well, it's very clear, really. The Council on American Islamic Relations, or CARE, it is an organization that is in every sense trying to destroy American defenses against the jihad and to render it impossible in every way imaginable for Americans to resist the advance of Sharia and Islam in the United States.
But it seems like a peaceful organization.
It's a very clever organization, although perhaps not as clever as they may think. It is an organization that bills itself as a Muslim civil rights organization. And unfortunately, one of the main causes, the main sources of its power is that the mainstream media, for reasons of its own, universally goes to CARE for quotations about Islam, for quotations about comments on various stories regarding Muslims, and never does it identify CARE as anything but a Muslim civil rights organization. Never. And yet, there are many things that are indicative of what CARE is really about. In the first place, it has been named by the Justice Department as an unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation Islamic charity case, the Holy Land Foundation was, a few years ago, the largest Muslim charity in the United States.
Right.
It has since been shut down because it was funneling the charitable funds to Hamas, the Islamic resistance movement in Israel,
Right.
that is listed on the State Department's list of terrorist groups. And of course, it's illegal to give money to terrorist groups, so Holy Land was shut down. CARE had a button right after 9/11 on its website saying, help the victims of 9/11, and you would click and give money, and the money went to the Holy Land Foundation and to Hamas.
And that wasn't enough reason to shut them down or something to take legal action against them?
To take legal action against CARE? The CARE is being investigated right now by the FBI. The outcome of that investigation is not yet determined, and I would hope they will be shut down eventually, and I think they will. But they've been given a free pass for a very long time, and great influence and access at the highest levels in Washington because of ignorance about Islam, political correctness, and fear.
They have several offices in all United States. Where
yes.
did they get the money from?
They have received funds from the Saudis in the past.
Okay.
There are some indications that that is not a steady stream. There was a young man who converted to Islam and became an intern at CARE, and he was actually just gathering information, and he wrote a book, Muslim Mafia, which came out a few months ago. And he found that they actually were having money difficulties and not being able to get a reliable source of income from the Saudis, but they have received money from the Saudis for particular initiatives in the past. Several of their officials have been arrested for various terrorism-related activities. Several of their officials also have made statements about how they want to see Islam become the only government in America, the Quran the only law of the land. And so it's really very clear when you look at it what this organization is all about. But most people don't seem interested in looking at it, and they still continue to wield great influence.
Are you worried that United States will become like UK in the future?
Yes. I think that what we see happening in Britain today is what will happen in the United States tomorrow. And what is happening in Britain today is an increasingly restive and assertive Islamic minority that is demanding more and more concessions from the British for the particularities of Islamic practice, and is openly proclaiming that ultimately Britain will become an Islamic state. And we will see that in the United States. We're already seeing a great deal more of that kind of thing, that kind of assertiveness and insistence that Americans must make special accommodations for Islamic law. And so there's only going to be more of it because nobody in authority seems interested in stopping it.
And what is the solution?
Well, I think the main thing we need to do is recognize what's happening. And to understand, for example, that when there are these controversies, like I can tell you last year, there was a controversy in meatpacking plants in Nebraska and Colorado. And the Muslim workers in both walked off the job and refused to work until they got special break times for Islamic prayers. Now, this was granted because the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission mandates that employers have to make special accommodation for particular religious practices. So they got it. They got what they wanted. But then something happened that no one expected. And that was that the non-Muslim employees in both plants protested and said, now you have set this up so that you're discriminating against us, because instead of everyone being treated equally and having the same break times, now they have this special break time we don't have, and we have to work harder to make up for them. And so, in other words, the Muslims have been established in those meatpacking plants as a privileged class that has rights beyond those of the non-Muslims, which is exactly what's mandated by Islamic law, and exactly the agenda of the Muslim Brotherhood in the West to establish that. And so, the first thing we need to do is understand what is going on in that kind of case, and that it's not just a case about religious discrimination, it's a case about granting a special place for Islamic law in the United States. And say, we're not going to accommodate Islamic law in the United States. Islamic law is at variance with the U.S. Constitution in numerous ways, in its denial of the freedom of speech, denial of the freedom of conscience, denial of the equality of rights of all people before the law. And so there's going to be no accommodation for Islamic law in the United States.
How can we approach this problem? If we take freedom from Muslims, eventually it's going to be taken from everybody else.
Well, that's a very important point, and we have to understand that there's a distinction that ought to be made between Islam as religious and Islam as political. Islam is a political system, a political agenda that is supremacist and intransigent and allows for no competitors. And so that is what we ought to be limiting in the United States. As an individual religious practice, it is a very different thing. And
so are you saying that we should remove the political aspect of Islam?
well, it's not as if that's going to be very easy. I don't have any illusions about that. But if we were, I think that we would be able to, in the United States, take much more effective action against political Islam if we acknowledge that there is political Islam and restrict it on the basis of the fact that it is incompatible with the U.S. Constitution, while doing nothing to impede individual Muslim religious practice. You want to pray 5 times a day, pray 5 times a day. However, if you want to take a job that requires you to be on the job at a time of prayer, then you have to pray some other time or get a different job. Don't expect there to be special privileges for Muslims that other people do not have. And as far as political Islam goes, insofar as it's incompatible with the U.S. Constitution, it should not be welcome here. After World War II, the United States occupied Japan for 8 years. And the MacArthur government issued a directive very early on that there would be no presence of Shinto, the militaristic religious creed that had fueled the growth of the Japanese Empire. There would be no presence for it in the government or schools.
So what
but it could be practiced individually.
What are they going to do with verses that talk about politics and implementing Sharia and doing all that? Should they just read it as history, as narrative?
As history, as allegory, as fable, as something that no longer applies and never will apply, or don't be here. But we have a different system of government and we're going to defend it.
And how should Christians be involved in this kind of awareness among the West in general, United States in specific?
Well, Christians need to understand in the first place that Islam doesn't love you.
That's obvious.
It's obvious to you. It's obvious to me. As Christians, we know that. But it is not obvious to most Christians in the United States because they are accepting these things that are being told, these soothing lies. And there are even many Christian leaders in the United States, like Rick Warren, who tell them Islam is a religion of peace. We should have accommodation of the Muslims. We should have more Muslims in the United States. We should understand that they are our brothers. Well, they are our brothers in the sense that we all share we are all created by the same God. And we should treat everyone with charity. At the same time, charity is not foolishness. It's not foolhardiness. It is not being unrealistic or dreamy or ignoring threats to our life and our continued existence and our civilization. So Christians have to understand this is a spiritual battle and that if the Muslims are victorious in what they want to do, that the Christians will be living in a vastly different society from what they're living in now. One that will be vastly more uncomfortable for them than anything they can imagine now, even in this age of rampant secularism and the war against Christianity that is being carried out by the cultural elites in the United States. Even that is not as bad as what they will live under as dhimmis in the Zumma under Islam. And so the Christians need to understand that they ought to be working together with other groups like the Jews, even non-believers in the United States.
How they can do it in a practical way? Should they hold seminars? Should they make...
Well, I think that seminars is a good idea to start with. It's not the only thing, but the first problem we have is nobody knows these things. And so we need to raise awareness. And I think framing these things in terms of human rights values that everyone shares is a first start, because then they will see that we do have these common interests, we have these common values, we should work together in this. And then from the seminars, from raising awareness, will come various actions. There are always more things to do. They are guided by events. For example, there is a case of a girl who is 17, who is, she was living in Ohio, and she converted from Islam to Christianity, Rifka Bari, and her father threatened to kill her. In complete accord with Islamic law about what you do with an apostate. And so she fled from her family
to Florida,
and then has become embroiled in a huge custody case. Now, I, knowing this, and my colleague Pamela Geller of Atlas Shrugs, the website online, atlasshrugs.com, saw this and thought, well, this is an issue of conscience. This is an issue of religious freedom. This is an issue of human rights.
Right.
And we can try to awaken Americans to what's going on with Islam in the United States if we raise awareness about this.
What happened to her?
Well, right now it's still in doubt, but it doesn't look good.
Right.
We have been writing about it a great deal, working about it. Pamela has written many articles about it. And also, we held a rally for her in Ohio and have been trying to have a presence in the in all the hearings, as well as to try to awaken people to the issue of apostasy and to the agenda here that the Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE, Here Again, and others are working in the United States essentially to enforce Islamic law provisions regarding apostasy.
Right.
And to, in the first place, with a female apostate, you don't kill her right away, you isolate her from everyone until she repents.
Right.
Or you put her to death if she doesn't. And so Rifka Bari is being isolated. She's being cut off from all her friends, prevented from having them visit her, and prevented from using the phone or the internet. And all these things are,
So
I don't think it's any coincidence.
It's happening in the United States.
Right. It's no coincidence, even though the Ohio foster care authorities have no idea this is what they're doing. They're doing it at the behest of her parents' lawyers.
Right.
They're enforcing Sharia
Right.
in the United States. So what I mean, the reason why I brought the whole thing up is because from awareness comes action, and we have been trying to act to save this girl. It's very difficult because her lawyers themselves don't have any idea about apostasy. They don't realize
Right.
that the opposition is playing the game all about Islam and about apostasy, but they don't even realize that. They think Islam is a religion of peace and there's nothing to it, so they're ruining their own case.
Right. And if I ask like about some people like Zohni Jasser and others who are trying to promote some kind of moderate Islam, and do you think we can work with these people and try to find a common ground?
Well, you know, I don't have any problem with, as a matter of fact, admire Muslims who stand up sincerely. And sincerely is the key word here, because there is a great deal of deception. But Muslims who stand up sincerely and say that they're...
wait, what do you mean here? That we cannot trust some initiatives? Like
Yes, that's correct.
Why?
Well, look at CARE, that bills itself as a civil rights organization.
Right.
And it's anything but. It's an arm of the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States.
So it's
and
a kind
Hamas.
of taqiyya, like hiding
course.
under another face, and
Yeah, the Quran. No, it's in the Hadith. We smile in the faces of some people, and behind their backs we curse them.
Right.
And the Quran says that you don't make friends, don't take as guardians your friends and protectors the unbelievers in preference to believers, unless you're doing it to guard yourselves against them.
Right.
In other words, and all the Tafsir at that point say this means you lie to them, you pretend to be their friend, you pretend to be their ally.
right.
And so that is something we have to be aware of that does happen. And I think one clear sign of it in the United States is when you have Muslims say that the Quran doesn't teach warfare. Muhammad was a man of peace. The Quran does not teach violence.
Then they go inside the mosque and they
Exactly.
give another message.
If I know if they're lying to me and I hear that, then I don't believe anything they say when they say that they're all about peace.
What about those who are sincere?
Well, those who are sincere, I think you will find they will say, like my late friend Tashbi Sayed, he did say that there were aspects of the Quranic teaching, aspects of Muhammad's teaching that had to be rejected because they did exhort to violence and warfare. Now, he was trying, and I'm not sure that the effort is
How
going to be
can he
successful.
adjust both of them, like rejecting some verses and staying as a Muslim?
Well, this is problematic.
Right.
You know, you certainly have to reject the literal understanding of the Quran, especially when it says Muhammad is the excellent example of conduct, and when it says this is the book not to be questioned, and so on. And then one would say, certainly the jihadis and traditional Islam, they would say, well, now you're not a Muslim, and you've departed from Islam.
Right.
The main thing, I think, to understand about these people is that however admirably they may be working, however sincere they might be, however they might be trying to do something that we may see as impossible or as very difficult, even though they are continuing the effort out of a sincere attempt to try to salvage this. The problem is that they have no following. Zuhdi Jasser does not have any significant following in
So
the Islamic
they are not
world.
going to succeed, in your opinion?
No, there is no. Remember the Free Muslims and Kamal Nawash a few years ago,
Right.
and they got international publicity. There was huge excitement because they were the Free Muslims against terrorism, going to march against terrorism in Washington. 25 people showed up, and most of them were not Muslims. So Muslims are not interested in marching against terrorism. You never saw it.
Right.
We saw marches against the cartoons
Right.
and riots and innocent people being killed for cartoons. We saw innocent people being killed and riots because the Pope of Rome said something. We saw riots about a teddy bear
Right.
in North Africa.
Right.
We've never seen anybody demonstrating against Osama bin Laden. They only are upset about Al-Qaeda when they kill Muslims, because you cannot kill a fellow Muslim.
Right.
And so there were demonstrations in Jordan when they blew up a hotel in Jordan and there were a lot of Muslims killed.
Right.
But there's never been a demonstration about killing non-Muslims. Never.
And what about Americans who are trying, like, I have a book here, A Deadly Misunderstanding by Mark Seligender.
Siljander, yeah, he was a congressman.
Right, and he's trying in like, I can say, strange way to find a common ground with Muslims. What do you think about these attempts?
I think that it's a deadly naivete. It's a deadly foolishness that Mark Siljander evidently does not know or does not care about the aspects of Islam that would subjugate him and his family.
Right.
And so he himself, a few years back, was indicted for various activities involving terrorists. And I think probably, I don't know the outcome of the case, but I think that probably he got involved in these things out of ignorance. Out of thinking these people are wonderful and they're so nice to me and the food is delicious and everything is great, and they lead him into places he never thought he would be.
Right. And he said, I saw his videos on his website, he said that he studied Islam in Arabic and Aramaic and Hebrew in 10 years. And this is like very shocking for me. Like I have been born and raised in Arabic and I still don't grasp a lot of
Yes.
terms and a lot of phrases. I need to look in dictionaries and books. And he thinks he understands Islam fully, and he found the solution that will solve all problems between Christians and Muslims.
It's very naive, but it's not. He's not alone. You know, the talk show host Glenn Beck, the news show host Glenn Beck, he wrote a few years back, I have read the Quran, the entire Quran, and I can tell you that I know Islam is a religion of peace.
Right.
So I think, well, maybe he read it with his eyes closed, and maybe Siljander studied Arabic in the same kind of way.
Right. Well, my last question here. We do a weekly live show to challenge Muslims and preach the gospel to them and change their way of thinking and their Islamic ideas and all this. What do you think us as former Muslims can do in the other side of the world trying to change the way Muslims think?
Well, I loved what you did with the Quran in changing the verses such as slay the unbelievers wherever you find them, so they say slay the Muslims wherever you find them,
right.
Or the Muslims are the most vile of created beings,
right.
Or passages of the Quran like that, it is a shock, I think, to Muslims when they hear that, because it can help them to realize how unilateral their thinking is.
Right.
There is, of course, as you well know, the dichotomy between the believer and the unbeliever is so strong in Islam that they don't see any contradiction when they say, well, the Swiss have banned minarets. Not even mosques, just minarets.
Right.
And that's terrible, and we have to protest, and
right.
we have to get them to stop it. But no, there can't be a church in Saudi Arabia.
No.
And they don't see any contradiction there, because they know the Muslims are the best of people. It's in the Quran. And so they have rights that other people don't have.
Right.
And so if you change that around and show them that there is a great injustice there, that I think that will waken people up. Also, there's so many contradictions in the Quran itself,
right.
and things that make no sense. Muhammad, for example, in the 10th surah is exhorted, he says, if you're in doubt, Allah says to him,
right.
if you're in doubt about what we're revealing to you, go to the Jews and Christians.
Right.
And so you go to the Jews and Christians, and they don't confirm it. And so as a result of that, the Islamic theologians have elaborated the idea that the Jews and Christians have corrupted their scriptures.
Right.
Well, okay, then where are the uncorrupted copies that Allah was telling Muhammad to go find? They must have existed in the 7th century, or he wouldn't have told him to go find them.
Right.
So where are they?
Right. Well, I just want to clarify my question. What do you think preaching the gospel in the Muslim world can do? Is it going to help? Is it going to be an effective tool in changing Muslims, changing this hate religion, changing those people who are victims of Islam?
Well, you know, it's very difficult to preach the gospel to Muslims because you know how vaccines work, and they give you a little bit of the disease, and then your body builds up an immunity, and so you resist it. The Quran is like that with Christianity. It gives you a little bit of it, enough so that you build up a resistance.
Right.
It tells you a little bit of things about Christ and about Christianity, but then tells you that it's all wrong and that the main elements of Christianity are false.
Right.
So that's very difficult to get around. Nonetheless, I think that it can't help but do good to preach a message of love and forgiveness and genuine peace in an environment where hatred and violence are exalted.
Right.
And so,
but even informing them, because most of Muslims, and you said it earlier, that most of Muslims, they don't know the teachings of the Quran. They don't know it. So, and if they know the truth will set them free. So if we tell them exactly what's going on and what the Quran says, do you think it's an effective tool?
Oh, I couldn't agree. I couldn't agree more. It's very effective. It's very important. The Quran, it's, you know, because you have decent people in the Islamic world. Like I say, human nature is everywhere the same.
Right.
And so you have people who want to love God, they want to serve God, they want to do the right thing.
Right.
And the only way they know to do that is to be a Muslim.
Okay.
And so then you inform them that this is part of your responsibility as a Muslim. Well, they might go two ways. They might say, well, then I guess I have to do it. Or they might say, well, wait a minute. That doesn't correspond with what seems to me to be right in conscience.
Right.
And there are many people like that. There was an American Muslim, Samir Parker, a convert to Islam.
Right.
And he wrote a lengthy, on a website, he wrote a lengthy refutation of everything in my books and saying, see, the Quran is actually peaceful, Islam is actually peaceful, and you're just making things worse by saying that it's not.
Right.
And then, after many months and no contact with me, he erased all that from his website, and he wrote an apology to Spencer on his website, which shocked me considerably. And he said, I realize that you're right about Islam, and I'm leaving Islam.
Wow.
And he's dropped out of sight because, of course, now he's in danger. And I wish him all the best and hope that he's well. But the difficulty there is obviously that now there's a price on his head. Now he's under the death sentence. But the thing is that he was an honest man.
Right.
He had to acknowledge ultimately this is what the Quran says.
Right.
This is what Muhammad teaches. And then as a human being, he couldn't go with that.
I forgot to ask you one question. It was your name was mentioned by Al-Qaeda, especially by Adam Gedhan.
Yes, hello, Adam.
So, what do you think? Why that you were significant, or like you were so important that you were mentioned by Al-Qaeda?
Well, I was very surprised by that, and I would doubt that Zawahiri or any of the other ones know who I am.
Because they don't read English.
Right, but Adam does, because Adam's an American.
Right.
And so Adam, I think, is more knowledgeable about, is this right, Adam? I think that he's more knowledgeable about the American writers about Islam than other people in Al-Qaeda. And so it was, I was honored in a certain sense that he's noticed my work, and I hope he's continued to keep up with it. And I look forward to his leaving Al-Qaeda, and of course he'll have to do some jail time, I'm afraid, because he's been charged with treason. Right. But in any case, I look forward to his repentance.
Thank you so much for being with us. And
thank you.
Wish you all the best.
You too. Thank you.
God bless you.